Good morning and welcome back. We'll finish out this week right now here in Numbers chapter 17 through 24 for the reading of this week. Doesn't finish out the book of Numbers yet, but it is a very busy book. And with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and get right into it because it's still busy as God is moving them up basically towards the land of Moab, and we're going to get ready to go into Canaan. But there's a lot of history right here to be written yet. So we begin in chapter 17. Aaron in the priesthood is validated basically by the budding rod. Moses takes the 12 rods from the other tribes, the leaders, and Aaron's rod puts them out, and overnight Aaron's rod buds, and that rod then is placed next to the testimony for all to know that Aaron's priesthood would never be challenged. You can't challenge that, especially after what Korah just did. So we have that done. So any rebels would have to recognize that. So we move into chapter 18, basically the duties and support of the Levites. And what this is the duties is a little bit of saying that God says, I have given you charge of my offerings. So all of the sacrifices, offerings, everything that's been done in the tabernacle, of course, is done by the Levites and by the priesthood. But God in turn gives them support. In verse 10, he says the Levites are allowed to eat the most holy gifts. Verse 12, all of the best of the offerings I give you. And in verse 20, he says, you shall have no other God. I am your inheritance. I am your portion and your inheritance. So he is not going to divide up any of the land when they get into Canaan with the Levites, although they would have their cities and their pasture land, but the major part of the major divisions will go to the other tribes. So that moves us into chapter 19, and from there we continue. Remember back in chapter 5, we talked about the red heifer, and that was just for the cleansing. So we see in verses 1 through 8 there the preparation of the sacrifice, which was the burning of the red heifer and the ashes mixed with water, and that water was used then to sprinkle anyone who touched a dead person. And it was for the removal of impurity. It was for purification of sin, of touching the dead person. And so that's just that discussion there. We get into chapter 20. Here's where Moses gets in trouble with God. This is the story where they are moving up. They're in the wilderness of Zin. They're at the waters of Meribah. And Moses is told by God to speak to the rock, and the waters would come out. Well, Moses in turn struck the rock. And as a result of that, Moses was told in verse 12 and following that they would not be the ones that would bring Israel up into Canaan. Because why? Because you did not treat me as holy. And if anybody would have treated God as holy, it would have been Moses. He knew better. But as it is, even Moses had to pay that price. And so we move on into verses 20 through 29, and we see the march to Moab. And along that march, Aaron dies. Understand this. Right now, we have just about finished the 40 years of wandering in the desert now. We're coming up to the point where we're moving up towards Moab. We're moving into a place where just before they're getting ready to enter into Canaan. Still a lot of history here left. But we're getting close to the end of that 40 years of wandering. And we'll see that. Chapter 21, as we move over, we see now at the time that they're moving that they are attacked by Arad. And Arad does a little bit of work on them. He defeats them, takes a few prisoners, but Israel in turn, the sons of Israel, they call on God and say, ask for guidance and ask for victory there, and God gives it to them. In verse 3, Arad is defeated. But right away, verses 4 through 9, they start complaining of water yet again up there in that wilderness of Zin. And so God sends them not the water, although they will get the water, but he sends the fiery serpents to start biting them. These are snakes that are biting them in that desert. And here's where the bronze serpent, God tells Moses to make the bronze serpent. He puts the serpent on the staff, and the command is, if anybody gets bit by the serpent, all you need to do is look at the serpent on the staff, the bronze serpent, and you will live. And so that is, it's interesting to look at. There's another part of this bronze serpent all the way forward in 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 4. Hezekiah has to eventually destroy this bronze serpent because the people of Israel are using it for an idol. That's just a future thing, just a thought way down the road before we get there. But that's one of the things that happened. That bronze serpent lasted a long time. And then what we see here is the verses 10 through 35. Israel moves up towards the plain of Moab, and along the way they fight with Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. And these lands that they are occupying as they go up, they eventually will become the land of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. This is all east of the Jordan River as they're moving up towards the plains of Moab. So this is giving them a lot of this. A lot of this is the second generation now that are doing this fighting. Remember, the first generation was going to fall in the desert, and they would not occupy the land. So here we are pretty close now to all of those, that first generation, now having died off. And we see in chapters 22 through 24, Israel moves up now onto the plains of Moab. And these three chapters, verses 22, 23, 24, here is Balaam and Balak. And Balak, who is the king of Moab, now he wants to get Balaam, son of Peor, to curse Israel. As you read through this is 3 full chapters of reading. We don't have a lot of time to talk about it. But as we read through it, Balaam is not allowed to curse Israel. He only can say what God allows him to say, and he winds up blessing Israel 3 times. And Balaam later he will get into trouble once as he will be killed in part of the fighting that goes on by Israel as they do the occupation. So Balaam winds up can't curse Israel, but he does things. He does 4 things here. Balaam has 4 prophecies in chapter 24, and these prophecies are verses 17, the Messiah, the ruler of Israel. Verses 17 through 21, the victory over Moab, Edom, Amalekites, and Kenites. In verse 22, the Assyrian captivity of Israel, probably in 722, and what this is very, very forward-looking here. In verse 24, the affliction of Assyria and the Hebrews. This looks way out into the future as Balaam sees some of these things, even from where he is and at this time. So this brings us through the close of chapter 24. The tribe of Israel is now moving up on the plains of Moab and getting ready now for the final assembly and to cross the Jordan, headed for Jericho, coming up not too far from now. So hopefully that you will, as we read through this, still there's a little bit of numbers left to go. Some of the battles and fights, and some preparation to take place. So in the division, by the way, in the occupation of Reuben and Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh, where they leave their kids, their children, and their flocks behind and go with the other tribes into war. So a lot is going to happen. This is a very, very busy time with Israel. So I hope that God gives you the ability to read and understand and the discernment of his word, and hopefully to see you again in a little while for the continued reading. And with that, may God bless the reading of his word.